message from our sponsor, the Royal Literary Fund.
Are you a professional writer struggling with financial difficulties? The Royal Literary Fund is here to support you. At the RLF, we believe that every writer deserves a chance to thrive, no matter what life throws your way. We offer a variety of hardship grants tailored to help professional writers in need, whether it's short-term relief or ongoing support. Perhaps you're dealing with an unexpected expense, a drop in income, or facing challenges that make writing difficult, such as illness, disability, or now relying on your pension. If you're eligible, our grants team will walk you through our discreet and confidential application process, ensuring you receive the support you need. Visit rlf.org.uk to check your eligibility and inquire today. The Royal Literary Fund. We believe writers matter because writing matters.
Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, we speak to the novelist Frederick Forsyth.
We spoke to Frederick about his career as a foreign correspondent, covering the Cold War and the Biafran War, about turning to fiction with The Day of the Jackal, and about his relationship with the intelligence services.
It's a great episode. We hope you enjoy it.
Freddie, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. We wanted to start with The Day of the Jackal, and we wondered if you could take us back to the time and the circumstances when you wrote the novel. We saw that it was a difficult period in your life after you'd been reporting in Biafra, that you had no money, you were sleeping on a friend's sofa. So take us back to that moment and tell us where you were and why you decided to try and write a novel.
Oh, very simple. Nothing else to do. I was at almost as far down as you can be in a young man's career. I was back from Africa. I hadn't got a job. I was unlikely to get one. I had been well demonised for having supported the Biafrans, which was not Foreign Office policy. And I'd left the BBC in a huff. I think it was a mutual huff. They wanted me out. I wanted to leave. So I'd already been freelance for over 6 months. And I'd come back from this ruined and starving African country to Britain. So the question was, what are you going to do now? And in a lunatic fashion, I said, I'm going to write a novel. And everybody I knew whom I consulted said, you must be absolutely mad. If you want to make money, rob a bank perhaps, but for God's sake, a novel, it's extremely unlikely to ever be published. It's even less likely to ever be a bestseller. What's it going to be about? I said to him about Charles de Gaulle. I said, well, that's a killer. Nobody wants to read about Charles de Gaulle. But I had this idea, and the reason I had the idea was that years earlier, working for Reuters, the news agency, I had covered the several assassinations, 2 of the 6 assassination attempts on Charles de Gaulle, which were real. They weren't fiction. They happened. And 6 times his potential assassins failed to get him. And I formed the view as I sort of trailed around Paris in those days, back in 62, 63, that the assassins who were the OAS, the secret armed organisation, who wanted to assassinate him because he was giving Algeria back to the Algerians, might possibly succeed if they brought in an outsider. I analysed their situation, and it seemed to me they'd been well penetrated by French counterintelligence. They were being picked up and imprisoned one after the other. Their assassins weren't getting close to the president. He was very well guarded, and they weren't going to succeed, but they might if they brought in an outsider who has never been on the radar at all in France, and possibly a sniper rifle rather than a handgun at short range. I didn't tell them that. I didn't put it around. It wasn't my business to advise them how to do the job better, but I stored it. And 7 years later, back from Africa, I thought, that might work. I'll use that as a theory, or as a theme, rather. The lone assassin with the sniper rifle. Now, at that time, killings of a quasi-political nature were almost entirely down to fanatics. The idea of a paid assassin was, I think, new. A mercenary who would kill on contract was new, and I think it's probably the reason for the success of the book eventually, was nobody had ever thought of it before. It just wasn't assumed to be why people killed people. The paid assassin was a world of gangsters and mafia only, not political. The idea of a detached one was innovative, I think. So there I sat down on the 2nd of January 1970, Couldn't sit on the first because I was hungover, as I suppose you mostly all are. And I began to tap into my faithful old wafer-thin portable typewriter, the one that accompanied me all my wanderings through Africa. I began to tap out page 1. And of course the first thing was the title. I'd mulled this over. Why? What kind of title? I thought, unusually again, I didn't realise how innovative I was being. I'm not going to give my man a name. He'll have a code name throughout the book, and right to his grave he will still be just the code name. I thought of an animal, a cobra, eagle, lion, a jaguar, leopard, whatever, and I wanted something different that hadn't ever been used before. And I thought, what's his characteristic? His characteristic is he's elusive. He comes in the night, does what he does, he's gone by morning, and nobody ever sees him. And that, I thought, I have to look at the African jungle. The most elusive creature is the jackal. So I hit upon the name the jackal as his code. The story just unfolded as I thought it would have happened had they engaged an assassin. Item by item, progress to eventually that high-placed attic room in a building overlooking a square where the president would hand out more war medals. Now, that was how I decided to end it. That was exactly the way Fred Zinnemann made it. The film, he stuck to the story like glue, as most unlike film directors. So what you see in the Edward Fox film is virtually the book. It took me 35 days. I wrote 10 pages of A4 paper a day for 35 days. And rather unusually, and if I say this boastfully, I suppose, not a word has ever been changed. It's the first draft that I handed in. It's what you read today, if you ever wanted to read it. I never changed a word. And this, I think, is unusual, because most books that you find in the bookshop are at the 10th edition or 10th rewrite. I've never rewritten it. It's never been rewritten. Not even the editors at Hutchinson rewrote it. They just left it exactly the way it was.
Very comprehensive, thank you. When you say not a word was changed, not even from when you were typing it on your typewriter?
Just one. I got to the end and I typed off the last line, which was the day of the jackal was over, then I tapped the end under it. And then I rolled back to page 1 and I thought it was called The Jackal. And I thought this could be mistaken for a documentary about African wildlife. So I tapped the word the day of in front, and that was the last I typed.
Could you tell us about the book's route to publication? How you went about getting it published? And we saw two things here. The first, that Charles de Gaulle's death at the end of 1970 was a factor, but also that it was a challenge to sell, as it were, a hypothetical, a novel that was about how something might be done rather than how something had actually happened. Tell us about how you went about getting the book into print.
I was an absolute novice. I didn't have an agent. I didn't know about publishing. I didn't know who to approach. So I literally hawked this manuscript round the West End from door to door. Anyone will tell you that there's one thing that a publisher shudders at the thought of. It's the unsolicited manuscript coming through the front door. I was at my 5th when I went into Hutchinson. I met the marvellous Harold Harris, who was the editorial director at Hutchinson. By then I'd hit on a wheeze, which was, I think, nobody's reading the damn thing, so I had written a 2-page synopsis. And I put this in front of him. I got into his presence by a ruse, lying, saying we knew each other socially, and got into his office, said I'd got a manuscript, and he said, oh dear, I was thinking, I'd better fire that secretary. But I gave him the 2 pages, and he read them in front of me. And something must have intrigued him, because he said, where's the manuscript? And I said, it's with, and I named another publisher. And he stared, pointed at the ceiling, and said, I could not dream of looking at a manuscript which is in the possession of another publisher. So I said, don't move, Mr. Harris, and got up, left, went down to the street, got a cab, went down to the publisher where it was lodged, withdrew it, and took it back and went into his office again and dumped it on his desk. He looked rather surprised that I'd done this so fast. And it was Friday afternoon, and he said, I'll call him on Monday. And to my surprise, he did call on Monday. He'd read it over the weekend in its entirety. And he said, if you'll be here at 4 o'clock, we'll talk about a contract. Which was, wow, like the sky's opening. So I was there at 4, but no agent. He said, haven't you got an agent? I said, no. Oh, he said, I think you ought to have an agent. Now, he could have screwed me, absolutely, taking me to the cleaners, so to speak. But he said, no, you need a good agent if you're going to handle your affairs. I know a very good one, Diana Crawford. So he rang Diana Crawford. She came in and became my agent, a brilliant agent, terrific agent. And so the book, it was clinched that would be published. I think it was a £500 advance, but then he said, I'd like you to write 2 more. Now, a 3-novel contract is, it'd beyond belief. He said, what else do you know about? I thought, well, I knew Germany intimately well, and I knew of the existence of a sort of subterranean neo-Nazi organisation there called ODESSA. And I'd just come back from Africa, and I knew about white mercenaries who were then, in the early 70s, still very much the talk, or the horror figure of the white mercenary fighting in Africa. So I said, I could do one about Nazis or white mercenaries in Africa. And he paused for a moment. He said, Nazis first, and then the white mercenaries. And I want Nazis by the end of next year. Now, this was September 1970. So I thought by December next year, that's 15 months. God, to research the Nazis and have a manuscript on his desk by December next year, I'd have to hurry. So the whole of 1971, I was actually, well, the whole of it, most of it, I was actually away. So the book was launched in May, and to everyone's amazement, mine especially, it exploded. And began to sell and sell and sell and sell. And then the American rights went in, the Japanese rights went. I was working away on exploring Nazis in Germany. I brought my manuscript in to find that I put it bluntly, I'd become quite wealthy. I didn't know why or how. I'd certainly never had money like that in my life before. Eventually I was offered £75,000 for the world rights in perpetuity. And being a numbskull, in money terms, I took it. It was probably worth several million, but I didn't know that. And I thought 75,000 was huge. Back then it was, actually. And certainly when you've never had that kind of money, it does seem a lot. So that was why I sold out the rights to the Day of the Jackal for £75,000. And it just roared and roared and roared. It kept on selling and kept on selling and kept on selling. Then the film came out, of course, with a major director, a new star, Edward Fox. And that had an effect on book sales. They roared again. And then came Odessa, which rode the back of the Day of the Jackal to become a bestseller within weeks of launch. And by then I was back in Africa exploring what I needed for the Dogs of War, novel number 3. So those 3 years were frenzied. I never stopped.
Could you put your finger on what it was that made it take off on publication?
I think it probably novelty. It was very, and I'm not being too big-headed here, but it was very accurate because I'd been there. I knew my Paris intimately well. I knew de Gaulle's bodyguards. I went quickly back to Paris to talk to a couple whom I got to know during the early 60s period. They were now in retirement. So when I said of Paris, it was like this, it looked like that, it was true. It was. It was very, very accurate. And I think that level of obsession, and it is an obsession in my case with accuracy, was, slightly innovative. People didn't think it was, they weren't accustomed to being told not only of that square, but the cafe on that square. Charles Chez-André. There was one man wrote me an amusing letter. He was actually sitting at a cafe. I mentioned in my book. He looked up and there was, if it was Chez-André, right above his head on the awning was Chez-André. And he said, after that I believed everything. I had to believe you told me the world was square.
We wanted to come back to the later novels in due course, but could we roll back now to your early life? We've seen elsewhere you said you did not originally think of yourself as cut out to be a novelist and you wanted to be a fighter pilot. Tell us about that phase in your life in the RAF, which you later wrote about aviation in The Shepherd, and then your move into journalism.
My first obsession, and it was an obsession as a boy, wasn't with journalism or even with writing. It was aeroplanes. I was obsessed by aeroplanes. I was born and raised in Kent, in the back then very sort of obscure little market town called Ashford, which is now a big sprawl of overspilled housing from London. But back then it was just a market town. And I was 2 when the war broke out, 3 when I still remember to this day a fixed frame image standing on the lawn of our house in Ashford. My father's khaki-trousered leg beside me, staring up at the sky and watching what I thought as a small boy were fish, blue against the blue sky above me. They were silver fish twisted and turned. They were, in fact, the Spitfires and Hurricanes of the RAF flying, and just winning the Battle of Britain in 1940-41. And my father revered them, those young men, the few, and he raised me to that viewpoint. So when I was 6, I think, he took me to, he had to confer with the commanding officer of a fighter base nearby. And he took me in the passenger seat of the car. And when he was in with the commanding officer, he left me with the pilots. And they made a fuss of me and took me into a hangar, and there one of them picked me up under the armpit and swung me as a little 6-year-old boy up into the air, and then dumped me in the cockpit of a Spitfire. And I remember sitting in this cockpit with the walls of the Spitfire on either side of me, and smelling. And what stuck with me were the odours, the webbing and the oil, the diesel, the gasoline, and fear. Fear has a smell, sort of coppery, sort of brassy smell. And I looked down this long cowling towards the 4-bladed propeller, and I made a little boy's oath, as little boys do. One day, I'm going to fly a Spitfire. Now, the time went by, I grew up. Unlike so many little boys, I kept on to my dream for a while, but most of them ebb and disappear. So the boy who wanted to become a train driver becomes an accountant or something. But I stuck with I'm going to fly a Spitfire. Well, actually, the Spitfire was phased out, but I did at 16 get an Air Force scholarship. That enabled me to learn to fly on open cockpit Tiger Moths. So at 16, I was wheeling and diving and turning and twisting over the Thames estuary in a Tiger Moth. And I was sneaking away from school to have these flying lessons on the tab of the RAF. I got my private pilot's license. And then when I could get out of school, I went straight to the Air Force and worked my way in, because I got in at 17 and a half when the legal minimum age was 18. And I applied for Flying Training Command and got it. Went through my 18 months, 2 years, and finally got my wings as a fighter pilot. The first proud moment of my life. I strutted up to an air marshal in a hangar and workshop. Mum and Dad sitting in the front row, very pleased as punch. And he pinned the wings of a pilot onto my chest. And I'd have stayed in the Air Force, except that I wanted a fighter squadron of supersonic jets. And I was laughingly told I'd be much more likely to be flying a desk. So I thought, no, I'm not going to wear this uniform with these wings and fly a desk. There's another thing I wanted to do, which was see the world. I wanted to travel. And I thought there's only one job I can think of that would do that for me, and that's foreign correspondent. I did 3 years apprenticeship in the Eastern Daily Press in Norfolk, and then went to Fleet Street and got a job with Reuters. I then spoke fluent French. They got me a job in Paris when the OES was trying to shoot Charles de Gaulle.
Can you tell us a little bit about that apprenticeship? How did you learn the tools of the trade, so to speak?
Well, I went to the local newspaper in Ashford. A very nice man edited it, and he said, we're a weekly, but I know a provincial daily, which is far better training for you. It's called the Eastern Daily Press, and it's a Norfolk paper, and I can give you a letter of introduction. So he did. I got an interview. Fortunately, the editor-in-chief was very keen on foreign languages. I happened to, by then, speak fluent French and German. I spent a long time, at my father's suggestion, with first a French family and a German family, living with them where they didn't speak a word of English. So I came back eventually from my second visit to Germany, fluent in both French and German. This seemed to please the editor-in-chief of the Eastern Daily Press, even though it didn't have any correspondence in Europe. Anyway, he gave me the job, and I spent 3 years under the marvellous Frank Keeler, who was the chief reporter at the King's Lynn branch. So I was in King's Lynn for 3 years, and then eventually took my final exam, the National Council for the Training of Journalists. I think I came second in England. I went straight down to Fleet Street to hawk myself around from door to door and to door, until eventually I got a job with Reuters, of all people, best of all, because they were just foreign correspondents. I got a job in Reuters on the London desk, and then again a stroke of luck. I've had so much luck, I can't believe the strokes of luck that have dominated my life. I was stuck on the London desk when the number 2 in Paris got a heart murmur. He could get free treatment on the NHS, but he couldn't get that in France. He had to pay. So they put him on the night flight home, escorted him home, and I was on the night flight out to join the Paris office at 22, and right into the maelstrom of an attempted assassination of the president by terrorists. I mean, this isn't normally Europe. We don't have that in Europe. Well, we did then. And France was on the threshold of revolution. So it was a hell of a time to be a cub reporter in Paris.
What do you think the impact of journalism was, both on your written style and the way you wrote, and on your research techniques?
Yes, it was absolutely crucial. Research techniques, obviously, what a reporter does. He asks questions, he probes, he tries to expose the hidden, reveal the scandal and so on. That's why we're called muckrakers. We wouldn't rake if the muck wasn't there. So I was very much into that. The succinct style of writing, editors don't want flowery page after page after page. They want concise, accurate description of what's going on. And I sometimes think that my manuscripts have been like long dispatches in some ways.
I saw in an interview you'd given elsewhere that you adopt a position as a kind of bumbling Englishman in order to convince people that you know less than you do and to convince them to tell you things. Is that a kind of persona you adopted during your journalism days?
It was actually what I began when I was posted from Paris to East Germany. After the building of the Berlin Wall, the West ostracized East Germany completely, and every single mission was discontinued and staff withdrawn and so on, bar one, which was Reuters. The Reuters man in East Berlin was retained, and he was the only one. So I got that post, and I was the only accredited Western correspondent in East Berlin, which gave the Stasis, the secret police of East Germany, for all the time they wanted. It got a huge staff and one target. So I was followed, and there was a flat opposite my flat where the window was permanently open because in deep recesses of the room was the camera focusing on my office windows and my front door. I know my office was bugged, my bedroom was bugged, my sitting room was bugged. Wherever I went on the street, there would be a car 100 yards behind me and 2 walking. A policeman who would be about 100 yards behind me. Sort of the brown or black leather coats looking like the Gestapo. They haven't changed much. And I thought there's only one way to fool these people, and that is to make fun of them. It's the one language they just simply haven't got. They cannot see that I'm pulling their legs. So I would affect, whenever I was in contact with them, to be this, I called him Bertie Wooster, if you remember Bertie Wooster of P.G. Wodehouse fame. I was a hapless, and hopeless, but trying to help, and completely stupid. So the appalling German, very poor vocabulary, a terrible accent. And when I went through Checkpoint Charlie into West Berlin, that's what I'd affect, to go through the formalities, to the point where they began to think, I'm quite certain they didn't tell me something, but they almost certainly thought it, how on earth and why would Reuters employ such a complete congenital idiot as their correspondent in East Berlin? And I'd keep this up until the red and white barrier pole came down behind me, and then drop it and become a German. So when I wanted to, I could become a German plus for a German among Germans. And that was very useful because I could then disappear into East Germany, and they'd lose me. They didn't know where I was. Because so long as I slept in the car and did all my ablutions in wayside cafes and didn't check into any hotel where I'd have to produce paperwork, I could stay out at the freedom, pretty much, and cover all sorts of stories I wasn't supposed to cover. And they could then motor back through West Berlin and file them out of West Berlin, which is, of course, Western, and then go through Checkpoint Charlie back into East Berlin and tell them I'd been examining brass rubbings.
Could you tell us, moving on from Berlin to the Biafra episode, how you initially went there for the BBC and then your decision to cover it as a freelance?
Yeah, it's a long story. I came back to London after 2.5 years with Reuters, and I thought wrongly that the future of journalism lay with radio TV. Obviously, we know that newspapers have continued in strength throughout then, but at the time I thought the future is in radio TV. And I applied to join the BBC, got an interview, got accepted. Once again, I ran into a senior reporter who was very keen on the fact that I spoke French and German and could see me going back to either France or Germany, but for the BBC. That was going along fine. I was based in London, but covering only European stories. And then two things happened. Firstly, the Nigeria-Biafra War broke out. The eastern region of Nigeria had been brutally treated by the central government, which was a brutal and very blood-stained dictatorship. And they sought in separate independence by declaring secession, which was viciously opposed by Lagos and by London. I was sent out there because everybody else was on the Middle Eastern War, the so-called Six-Day War. All our foreign correspondents were either in Israel or Lebanon or Damascus or somewhere. They hadn't got any spares, and the head came around the door and said, "Can you go to West Africa?" I said, "I don't do Africa." "Oh, go on, Freddie, just go out there. It'll last a week." Well, it lasted 2.5 years. That was how accurate the predictions of the Foreign Commonwealth Office was. Completely, absolutely nothing about it. But we had an extremely bigoted High Commissioner in Lagos who was fanatically pro-Lagos, the government he was attached to. And I was sent to the other side. So we had a very senior West African correspondent on the Lagos side, and this hitherto unheard of young man from London temporarily, so ran the received wisdom, covering the Biafran side. And then things went completely different from what was predicted. The Biafrans began to advance, not retreat, and I was with them. And I was filing by telex stuff they didn't want to hear in London, that the Biafrans were actually winning. They were at least advancing against the Nigerians. The Nigerian army had come to a complete stop. Its invasion and occupation of Biafra hadn't happened. I said it wasn't going to happen at this rate, and that was not what they wanted to hear in London. So I was recalled and roundly rebuked for bias. I said, "Well, it's not bias, actually." 6 months later, it was quite clear that every single prediction had been wrong. Foreign Office got it completely wrong. The Commonwealth Relations Office had got it completely wrong. Our High Commissioner in Lagos was an idiot, and a very biased idiot to boot. The war had settled down to stalemate, but in the course of the stalemate, all the access points for food into the eastern region had been blocked and the children of Biafra began to starve. And that made a news story, because when those pictures, which I was helpful in bringing back to London, of starving African children, which had never been seen before. We see them now, of course. We see them every evening on our fund appeals. But back then, we, the British people, had not seen little children reduced to living skeletons. And this caused a furor. There were demonstrations and placards on the streets, and what you now see in sort of stop extinction, oil extinctions on it, that was taking place then, but with a different cause. The different cause was send food to the Biafran children. So I decided at that point I'd had enough of the BBC and its bias, and I quit and went back as a freelance. Got a few contracts, went back. But by then the story had mainly changed from the fighting. Occasional story about the fighting, but not much, because there wasn't much fighting going on. But the big story was the food trains, which donors were trying to get through to Biafra. So I got back inside Biafra. I knew the man who led the Biafrans, Colonel Ojukwu, very well, and he said, "Yeah, sure, by all means, stay and report. So you've always been a good friend of us until now, so stay and report." So I got a position as virtually the main source of news about the food train coming in. They were coming in by night flights out of an offshore island called Sao Tome, and landing at an airfield strip, which was really a cleared section of motorway, inside the surrounding enclave. And we used to offload sack after sack after sack of relief food to try and alleviate the starving children. These food supplies were mainly distributed by the nuns and priests of the missions. They were our allies, but the little group of us, used to go wait in the darkness and then run up the plank into the back of the aircraft and grab a sack of something, a 100-weight sack, run back down and so on, and keep running until the plane was empty. Then often they never turned their engines off, they just kept them wheeling, and then we'd turn around and fly off into the blackness before dawn, because at dawn the Nigerian fighters would reappear. So it was quite eventful. But eventually, the Biafrans could take no more, and they collapsed in December 1969. And I flew out, I think, on the third from last flight out of that airport to Libreville, Gabon, and from there to Paris, and Paris back home to London. To find ourselves, I said at the start of this interview, absolutely skint. And homeless and carless and jobless. And that's when I wrote Day of the Jackal.
As long-time listeners of the show will know, we published Always Take Notes, advice from some of the world's greatest writers, in 2023. We're pleased to say that we have now put together a new and updated edition of the book, which now features contributions from more than 100 past guests on the podcast.
The book, which is available now, is the distillation of the wit and wisdom we've heard over the past 7 years. It offers frank and entertaining guidance on writing in particular and living a creative life in general. It answers questions such as, where do the best ideas come from? How do you stay motivated? What does it take to become a published author? And how do you actually make money from your writing?
Alongside all the great guests we quoted in the first edition, the update includes new material from Harlan Coben, Victoria Hislop, Lee Child, Megan Nolan, Jhumpa Lahiri, Philippa Gregory, Joe Nesbo, Paul Theroux, Hisham Matar and Bettany Hughes.
Published by Ithaca Press, the latest edition of Always Take Notes, advice from some of the world's greatest writers, is available from all good bookshops. We hope you enjoy reading it. Am I right in thinking that it was during that period that you were approached by MI6? Could you tell us a little bit about that initial approach and also how that relationship took shape and helped or not with the novel writing?
I was approached in an ice cream bar by a chap who later became a good friend, and he said that he'd just been appointed as head of Africa for MI6, also known as SIS, also known as the firm, but he knew nothing about it. And I just got back and I knew all about it. Could I help him out? So I said, what do you want to know? He said, well, basically, we want a bit more than that. We'd like you to go back. I said, no, I've left. This was in the midsummer of 1969. I said, no, I've left. He said, go on, go back. But he offered me a lure. He said, we're having an up and downer with the Foreign Office. Now, technically speaking, he said the firm comes under the Foreign Office. But we're sitting in these COBRA meetings and disagreeing with what our superiors are telling the government. But if we had a man on the spot, that would give us a huge edge to say we've just had a report in from our man on the spot, all hyphenated, and that would overrule the oblique reports coming in from the Foreign Office who were getting everything via Lagos, which was 300 miles from the scene of the action. So I said, all right. So I went back in for the last 6 months of the war with, so to speak, a new contact in London. I wasn't reporting for the Beeb anymore. I certainly wasn't reporting for anybody else. I was just reporting to the firm. And they seemed to be very grateful for that. And then the war ended and I came back out. But over the years, I maintained contacts. I did a bit of errand running. I think errand running is probably accurate. I just asked to pop over to East Germany and have a look and do something and come back.
And is it right that you submitted some of your subsequent novels to the security services as well for a form of vetting?
I had a contact, and I thought that there are some passages I'd like to write, but they might be too indelicate or dangerous even if I revealed tradecraft that they didn't want revealed. So I would get in touch with him sometimes and slip him 2 or 3 pages and say, just run them through the committee and see if they're all right. And usually they came back and said, yeah, no problem, Freddie, it's okay. Sometimes it'd be, well, we'd refer you didn't mention that because we're still using it. It's a method we're still using, and we don't want it revealed to our enemies. So I'd cut it out.
What was it like writing the Odessa file? You know, you wrote The Day of the Jackal in this extraordinary 30-day streak. Did you have the same kind of experience writing your follow-up, or was that kind of second album syndrome? Much
more leisurely. The Odessa file, I'd only been told about a strange organisation called the ODESSA, which in German is Organisation of Former Members of the SS, which was a body of exactly that, former members of the SS. Don't forget, in the early 1970s, that was only 25 years after the end of the war. And so someone could have been a top Nazi at 30 in the war and still only be 55, and possibly in very high office inside the civil service while remaining a dedicated Nazi. So they were present. They weren't ancient history as they are nowadays. The job as ODESSA saw it was to warn its members if they were being investigated for past war crimes. The hunting down of Nazi war criminals went on, right through the 60s and 70s into the 80s. And some were being picked up even into their age-wise 80s. So someone being picked up at 80, born in 1900, would have been 45 when the war ended. So it could well have been a senior Nazi. And 35 years later, at age 80, still he could be picked up and charged in West Germany. There were a number of occasions where the phone rang just before an arrest took place, and a voice on the phone said, "Get out now, South Africa or South America." And he would be gone by dawn, and the police had arrived in the mid-morning, empty house, empty flat, gone, disappeared, forewarned, tipped off. By whom? Well, someone in the establishment. So that was the Odessa.
It's a rule of the podcast that we always ask about money and how it interacts with people's writing lives. And you've alluded to this already at the gestation of Day of the Jackal. But how did that side develop for you? And be as guarded or as candid as you're happy to. But we also saw particularly that you at one stage lost a lot of money to a confidence trickster, and then you were able to earn it back.
I did. Yes, I wrote for 20 years. Yes. And I thought was a good and loyal and true friend. Turned out to be an absolute rat. But he was in the investment business. I entrusted my fortune to him for investment. He assured me it was safely and profitably invested. Modest profits, but safe, which is what I asked for. I later discovered when he went bankrupt that he'd embezzled the lot. And he'd reduced me to, pennilessness. So I had to start all over again. So I made a second fortune from 50 onwards. And I'm now 86. And in fact, I'm not wealthy, but I mean comfortably off, I think is the word.
And if we talk now about the new adaptation of The Day of the Jackal, have you seen it? What do you make of it? And how do you feel about it being in a contemporary setting?
It's 10 episodes, about an hour each. So that's 10 hours. Now, Fred Zinnemann's film was 2 hours, 10 minutes. So this is a gigantic work compared to the film made by Fred Zinnemann. So we're talking here about enough, I would have thought, time, if not material, enough time, for 4 or 5 books. And clearly to fill that time, the story has to be much, much bigger than anything I wrote. And having seen episode 1, it clearly is much, much bigger. So all I can say, I can see in common, there's a good, menacing killer. I think that Eddie Redmayne is superb, what I've seen of him. The media have already printed pictures of Edward Fox squinting down a sniper scope and of Eddie Redmayne squinting down a sniper scope. So there's a similarity there. But there are other great differences between them. One's a married man, the new one's a married man, lives in quite a large mansion in Spain, has got a Latino wife who doesn't know what he does for a living. So that's completely different because I had a bachelor Jackal. In fact, we never know anything about his Jackal private life in the book that I wrote. So in other words, there's a huge amount of expansion necessary. And the first episode doesn't even mention or touch upon his eventual mission, the mission that's going to have to occupy the next 8 or 9 episodes. So I'm really as much at a mystery as anybody else. I saw episode 1 last night, and I shall watch 2, 3 and 4 tonight, and then I shall wait eventually. Presumably there'll be some thumping climax in episode 10. But I wouldn't even begin to predict it because I have no faintest idea what his mission is going to be.
You've been quite outspoken on political issues in the last 2 decades, on things like Brexit and things like that. Did you feel, we saw some comments elsewhere that you had some concerns about a kind of woke remake of Day of the Jackal. What are your thoughts on that?
I know that filmmaking is completely different from novel writing. And in fact, Fred Zinnemann was unusual in sticking like glue to the original plotline. Most film directors do not stick to the plotline. They wander, sometimes they completely rewrite. And I had to make up my mind, I think, quite early on. Are you going to sort of be a fault-finding whiner, or just shrug and say, "Oh, get on with it"? And I decided I'd take the second option. So I let the filmmaker get on with it. It's his craft, not mine. and he chose it and I didn't. So if you want to make sort of, I don't know, whatever it is, make it. And if it works, it works. Sometimes it does work. Filmically it works. Sometimes it doesn't. There have been failures where a good book and a popular book has been made into an appalling film and has sunk without trace. I don't comment either way. Goody, serve him right, or, oh, sorry about that. I just say, well, whatever it is, it is. You made your work and I made mine. And let's leave it at that. So that's what I'm going to do with the new edition.
Fair enough. As a final question from me, you announced a few years ago that you were giving up writing novels, partly because you couldn't do the kind of strenuous research involved. But earlier this year, it was announced that you are co-writing a kind of sequel to the Odessa File. How's that experience been for you?
I'm supplying a few ideas, a few suggestions, but I wouldn't call that co-writing. I think the Odessa File sequel will be written by the very talented writer who's been engaged for it, in the same way as happened with Jackal. So I'm not going to get, as they say, put my oar in. I'll make a few suggestions. That you might do this, might do that, might do the other. I think one of the big problems is bridging the gulf in time, because since from those books to now is about 40 odd years, and things have happened, and tastes have changed, and one or two generations have grown up who have no knowledge of Nazis or Jackals or de Gaulles or anybody else. They're not interested. So they want something modern, up to date. I'm the opposite. I'm at 86. I'm way past it. Of the modern age, I mean. I don't understand it. I don't understand the technology. I don't have a Palm Pilot or a laptop or a desktop or any kind of computer. I wouldn't know how to work a computer if I had one. Nowadays, of course, the young, well, frankly, they're never more inches away from their mobile phone. Can't live without it. So that's different from me. I don't therefore interfere. I accept that I'm useless at it. I've got, technology, I mean modern technology, and I can't master it, I can't understand it, and so I'm not really interested in it. And in any case, at 86, I think whatever contribution I've ever going to make, I've made it. So I'm now fully into retirement. That's why I stopped writing novels. I did one last novel, The Fox, and thought to myself, that's it. I really haven't got another novel in me, and I'm going to do one.
Well, look, Freddie, thank you for a fascinating and broad-ranging conversation. We really appreciate you taking us back to some of those times and also up to the present, and wishing you all the very best.
Thank you, very kind.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Frederick Forsyth. His website is freddyforsyth.com. He's on Twitter at Freddy Forsyth, and The Day of the Jackal is currently playing on Sky. Hello, it's us again. Rachel, what was your takeaway from the interview with Frederick Forsyth?
Other than his extraordinary non-editing process, I really enjoyed hearing about his journalism career and how that evolved, and in particular the persona of the bumbling Englishman and how useful that can be, and the importance as well of asking stupid questions and getting information that people might not otherwise give you. We didn't really manage to cover some of his later novels, of which there are many, but I still feel like it was a very insightful and interesting conversation. How about you?
Well, I read a lot. I was going to say all, I don't think all, but a lot of these novels when I was a child. So it was kind of fascinating for me to return to them and interview him. It's interesting on that thing about him only supposedly having done one draft. I was discussing it with a few people after I did the interview and immediately encountered skepticism. And I suppose one always wonders with these stories of, how people sold their first book and how they wrote it. You do wonder if they're subject to embellishing. But, he did seem fairly adamant on it, which was fascinating. And yeah, I thought it was interesting how his kind of sharp elbows that he had sharpened journalistically, doing difficult reporting overseas, he then brought to bear to penetrate the English publishing industry. So yeah, overall, definitely a good addition to our pantheon of novelists, but also particularly thriller writers. Anyway, Rachel, what have you been up to and what have you been consuming culturally?
I've just filed a piece for the Britain section on the state of the gin industry, which was good fun. Although actually, after 15 years of booming, it's now in a slightly more bitter place, so to speak. It's absolutely full of drinking puns, so I apologise to anyone who eventually reads it. I'm working on another story about the forthcoming adaptation of 100 Years of Solitude, so I'm rereading Marcus's novel ahead of that. And I've also been watching some quite trashy Christmas films for another piece I'm working on to do with that genre. So, various things. And there are a couple of things on my watch list which I want to get around to at some point. Say Nothing by former guest of the show, Patrick Radden Keefe, and the new season of Bad Sisters. I really enjoyed that when it first came out on Apple TV. So hopefully at some point we'll get to watch those. How about you?
I've been working away on my book, which actually the end is almost in sight, which is quite odd because it's been this sort of huge albatross for so long. But if all goes according to plan, then at the end of next week I will finish, and then I will have a month to cut and to trim. So suddenly it seems from being like something that will never be over to something that will be over quite soon. Obviously, this is a first draft, but it's nonetheless exciting. In terms of reading, I've been reading a book called Tormented Hope, which is about hypochondria by a man called Brian Dillon, which is partly research for my book. I also, inspired actually by our interview with Frederick Forsyth, I went back and I watched the original film from the 1970s, which was extremely entertaining, and I commend to all our listeners. I thought often, with a film that's just, if it's 50 odd years old, that just the production values are going to be like, you can't kind of get to it. But actually I found it really fascinating. And bizarrely, there was an actor in it who's related to a woman I wrote about in my book in a kind of weird crossover and things like that. So yeah, it was an extremely enjoyable evening. And then I have also started watching Say Nothing, which I thought was very interesting. I was reading some of the reviews, and there was a bit of interesting kind of piece in The Guardian that pushed against some of the generally extremely positive coverage, saying that it was a bit overly enthusiastic for the IRA. But I thought it was interesting because I suppose from my military background and stuff, had consumed a lot of quite hagiographical media when I was much younger about the other side. It's interesting to see that side of it. And I particularly enjoy Rory Kinnear playing a kind of famous / notorious British Army officer called Frank Kitson, to clarify on that. So yeah, that's very inside baseball, but that's what I have been doing. And we'd also like to thank a new supporter of Always Take Notes on Patreon, Ed Siddons.
Ed is a reporter at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, and he has stories published by the Sunday Times, The Observer, The Guardian, The Times, and a recent long-form piece for 1843 magazine was on London's fiercest defamation firm, Carter-Ruck. Thank you so much, Ed, for your support of the podcast. And one last thing to note before we sign off, that this is the 200th episode of Always Take Notes. Simon, how does it feel?
Astonishing, really. Who knew it would go on for this long? And it's about, I don't know if we have the numbers, but it's about the 150th, Rachel, that you and I have done together, I think, as well. So it's been a great pleasure, and long may it continue.
Indeed.
Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acombe.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jessica Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Instagram at Always Take Notes. We're on Twitter at Take Notes Always. If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.